Welcome, everyone. Ready to dive into eosinophilic esophagitis, or EOE for short.
It's a mouthful, I know.
It is, but it's a condition that's definitely worth understanding, especially with how common it's becoming.
Absolutely. And we've got some great resources to guide us today.
Yeah, we've got the latest clinical guidelines from the American Gastroenterological Association and the Joint Task Force on Allergy Immunology, and of course, we'll be referencing UpToDate as well.
She gave us a pretty comprehensive look at this condition.
Exactly. So let's try to make sense of EOE, figure out the causes, symptoms, diagnosis, treatment, all that good stuff.
Sounds like a plan.
So EOE, once upon a time, it was just kind of lumped in with like really bad heartburn.
Oh, yeah. I remember those days.
But we've come a long way since then, right?
Definitely. We know now it's a distinct condition.
With its own mechanisms and everything.
Involving a type of white blood cell called eosinophils.
Right. And these eosinophils, they build up in the esophagus, causing all sorts of trouble.
The esophagus being that tube that carries food from your mouth to your stomach, just to clarify.
Right, of course. So it's not just heartburn, it's something much more specific.
Yeah, and it's not just a few eosinophils either. We're talking a significant buildup.
And what's really striking is how much EOE is on the rise. Like, it's gone from relatively rare to something doctors are diagnosing more and more.
Especially in Western countries and urban areas, it's really interesting.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if it's something in our environment.
Right.
What's changing?
It really does, and while anyone can get EOE, it seems to be most common in adults in their 30s.
Huh, okay.
And interestingly, men are diagnosed more often than women.
Now, that is interesting. Is there any connection between having allergies and developing EOE?
That's a great question, and it's something researchers are still trying to sort of unravel.
Right.
But we do know there's a strong link between EOE and other allergic conditions, things like asthma, eczema, food allergies, all that.
So it's all kind of tied together in some way, huh?
It seems that way, but whether allergies directly cause EOE or if there's some common underlying trigger, that's still up for debate.
Okay, so we know it's more than just a bit of heartburn, but what kind of symptoms are we talking about here? What does EOE actually feel like?
Well, imagine trying to enjoy your favorite meal, but every bite feels like it's getting stuck in your throat.
Oh, that sounds awful.
Yeah, it can be really distressing.
I can only imagine how frustrating that would be.
And for many adults with EOE, that's their reality, difficulty swallowing, especially solid foods. It's the hallmark symptom.
And I imagine it really impacts your quality of life, right? If you can't even enjoy a meal.
Absolutely. Some people even experience food impaction, where food gets completely lodged in the esophagus.
Wow, that's serious.
Yeah, it can require medical intervention, sometimes even a trip to the ER because you can't swallow.
That's scary. And UpToDate actually mentions that between 12 and 44% of people with EOE have a history of food impaction.
Which is a pretty significant number.
Yeah. It is. So it's definitely not something to take lightly. What about kids? How does EOE affect them differently?
Children with EOE often have feeding difficulties, vomiting, abdominal pain, and of course, that same difficulty swallowing.
It must be so hard for parents to see their kids struggle with something as basic as eating.
It is. It's really tough.
Okay, so let's say you suspect you or your child might have EOE. How is it actually diagnosed? Is there like a simple test you can take?
Well, I wish it were that simple, but unfortunately, it takes a bit more detective work.
Okay.
Doctors have to look at your symptoms, but that's just part of the picture.
Right.
They also need to see what's going on inside your esophagus with a procedure called an endoscopy.
So it's not as simple as just popping an antacid. What exactly happens during an endoscopy?
An endoscopy, it allows the doctor to directly visualize the lining of your esophagus using a thin, flexible tube with a camera attached.
Oh, okay, so they can actually see what's going on in there.
Exactly, and they're looking for telltale signs of EOE, things like rings, furrows, white plaques, or even a general narrowing of the esophagus.
So they're looking for specific visual clues. Is that enough to make a diagnosis?
It's helpful, but to confirm EOE, they need to look the cells under a microscope.
Okay.
So they take small biopsies during the endoscopy and examine them for that specific type of white blood cell, the eosinophils.
Right, right. And the presence of a certain number of eosinophils in those biopsies, that's the gold standard for diagnosing EOE.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's a combination of symptoms, visual inspection during the endoscopy, and then microscopic examination of the biopsies.
It's a multi-step process.
Seems pretty thorough, but there's a catch, right?
Yeah.
Didn't we say GOD could mimic EOE?
You're absolutely right. That's why it's so crucial to rule out other conditions
Yeah.
like GOD before confirming an EOE diagnosis. GOE can have similar symptoms, and even some of the endoscopic findings can overlap.
Oh, wow. So it really highlights the importance of having an experienced doctor who can accurately interpret all those results.
Absolutely, you need someone who can put all the pieces of the puzzle together.
Makes sense. So you need a doctor who's a bit of a detective to really figure this out. Now, once EOE is diagnosed, is there a cure? Or is it something you have to manage long term?
Unfortunately, there's no cure for EOE yet, but the good news is there are effective ways to manage the condition and improve your quality of life.
Okay, that's good to hear. So, what are the current treatment options for EOE? Is it all about diet or are there medications involved as well?
It's actually a multifaceted approach. Treatment for EOE typically falls into three main categories: dietary therapy, pharmacological therapy, and in some cases, a procedure called esophageal dilation.
Okay, so let's break those down one by one. Starting with dietary therapy, what exactly does that involve?
Dietary therapy is all about identifying and eliminating the foods that trigger inflammation in your esophagus. It's like becoming a food detective.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, you have to carefully track what you eat and how your body responds.
So, it's kind of like avoiding foods you're allergic to. Are we talking about the usual suspects like peanuts and shellfish?
Sometimes it is those usual suspects, milk, soy, eggs, wheat, peanuts, tree nuts.
Right, the common culprits.
Exactly. Those are often the first to be eliminated, but sometimes the culprits are a bit less obvious.
Like what? Give me an example.
Imagine loving pizza, but discovering that tomato sauce is a trigger for your EOE.
Oh, no.
Yeah, it can be tricky to figure out without careful tracking and elimination.
I can see how that would be tough, especially for people who really love those trigger foods.
It definitely requires a lot of discipline.
It does. So, how do you figure out which foods are causing problems? Is it just trial and error?
It can involve some trial and error,
Mm.
but there are more structured approaches as well. One common method is an elimination diet, where you systematically remove certain foods and then reintroduce them one by one.
So, you're basically playing detective with your own diet.
Exactly.
Sounds like it takes a lot of dedication.
It does, but it can be really effective.
What if avoiding those trigger foods just isn't enough? Are there medications that can help manage EOE?
Absolutely. That's where pharmacological therapy comes in.
Okay, so let's talk about those medications.
There are a few different types that doctors might prescribe, depending on the individual and the severity of their EOE.
All right, let's break it down. What are we talking about here?
One type is proton pump inhibitors, or PPIs, which are commonly used to treat heartburn and GERD.
Okay.
They reduce acid production in the stomach, and while they might offer some relief for some people with EOE, they don't address the underlying inflammation.
So they're more of a band-aid than a cure. What about medications that actually target that inflammation directly?
That's where topical glucocorticosteroids come in.
Okay.
These medications work by suppressing the immune response in the esophagus, reducing inflammation, and allowing the tissue to heal.
Topical glucocorticosteroids? Or those like steroid creams?
Similar concept, but instead of being applied to the skin, they're delivered directly to the lining of the esophagus, usually in the form of a swallowed liquid or spray.
Ah, so it's a more targeted approach.
Exactly. They target the inflammation right where it's happening with fewer systemic side effects.
Makes sense. What are some examples of these topical steroids?
Budesonide and fluticasone are two commonly prescribed ones.
Okay.
And there's also a newer biologic medication called dupilumab, which has shown promise in recent clinical trials for EOE.
So that's PPIs to manage symptoms and topical glucocorticosteroids or biologics to tackle the inflammation itself. What about this esophageal dilation you mentioned? When is that necessary?
Esophageal dilation is a procedure that's considered when a patient develops a stricture, which is a narrowing of the esophagus.
Okay.
This can happen due to long-term inflammation and scarring, making it difficult to swallow.
So it's kind of like opening up a bottleneck in the esophagus.
Exactly. The procedure involves using a special instrument to gently widen the narrowed area, allowing food to pass through more easily.
But it's important to remember that dilation only addresses the symptom, the narrowing, not the underlying inflammation, right?
You got
So you'd still need to manage the EOE with medications or dietary changes even after the dilation.
Absolutely. Otherwise, the stricture is likely to recur.
Okay. And it's important to note that esophageal dilation, while generally safe, does carry some risks.
Right. It's not a decision to be taken lightly.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Diagnosing EOE, the different treatment approaches, the fact that it's a chronic condition requiring ongoing management.
It's a lot to take in.
It is. I'm curious, though, what's next? Where do we go from here?
Well, there's so much more to unpack. We've just scratched the surface of this complex condition.
I figured as much.
Next, we'll delve deeper into those intricacies of dietary therapy, break down those pharmacological treatments in more detail, and then we'll explore what the future holds for EOE research and potential breakthroughs.
Sounds like we're in for a fascinating deep dive. Stay tuned, everyone. This is just the beginning of our exploration.
We've got a lot more to cover.
All right, we're back, ready to dig a little deeper into eosinophilic esophagitis.
Yeah, there's always more to explore, especially with a condition as complex as EOE.
Definitely. So let's pick up where we left off and really get into those nitty-gritty details.
Sounded good to me.
So we talked about dietary therapy being a key part of managing EOE, but how do you actually figure out which foods are the problem?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
It can't be easy to pinpoint those triggers, right?
It really is. You're right. It's not like you eat something and immediately have trouble swallowing.
Right.
The connection isn't always that clear-cut.
So it's not like a peanut allergy where you know right away.
Exactly. It's a bit more subtle, a bit more sneaky.
So how do you go about uncovering those hidden triggers?
Well, there are a few different approaches. One is the elimination diet, which we touched on earlier.
Right, right.
It involves systematically removing certain foods from your diet and then slowly reintroducing them one by one.
So you're basically playing detective with your own diet.
That's a great way to put it. It's a process of elimination. Literally,
So what kinds of foods are usually the first to go on an elimination diet?
doctors often start with the most common food allergens. Things like milk, soy, eggs, wheat, peanuts, and tree nuts.
Okay, makes sense. Those are the usual suspects.
Exactly. They're behind a lot of food sensitivities.
But what if you eliminate those common allergens and you're still having symptoms?
Well, then the investigation continues.
So there are other foods that could be contributing to EOE?
Oh, absolutely. Sometimes it's the less obvious culprits, things like corn, beef, or even certain spices.
Wow, so it could be almost anything.
It really could, which is why allergy testing can be so helpful.
Oh, interesting. So allergy testing isn't just for seasonal allergies.
Not at all. It can play a big role in managing EOE.
Okay, I didn't realize that.
Allergy testing can help identify those hidden food sensitivities that you might not even suspect.
So are we talking skin prick tests, blood tests, that sort of thing?
Exactly. Both of those can reveal whether your immune system is reacting to certain foods.
That's really helpful. So let's say you've identified your food triggers, whether through an elimination diet or allergy testing. Does that mean you have to avoid those foods forever?
It depends. It really does.
Okay.
It depends on the individual and the severity of their EOE. For some people, strict avoidance might be necessary for long-term control.
Right.
But in other cases, once the inflammation's under control, they might be able to reintroduce certain foods in small amounts without triggering symptoms.
So it's about finding that balance.
Precisely. Finding that balance between managing your EOE and still being able to enjoy food. And it's a journey, not a destination.
It's a process. It's ongoing.
Exactly. It often requires ongoing tweaking and adjustments as you learn more about your body and how it reacts to different foods.
And I imagine working with a registered dietitian can be incredibly helpful during this process.
Oh, absolutely. They can provide guidance, support, and help you create a meal plan that's both nutritious and tailored to your specific needs.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about dietary therapy. Let's move on to those pharmacological treatments for EOE. We briefly mentioned proton pump inhibitors or PPIs last time. Are those usually the first line of defense?
PPIs are often used for GOD, but their role in EOE is a little less clear-cut.
Okay.
While they might offer some symptom relief by reducing stomach acid, they don't actually address the underlying inflammation that's driving EOE.
So they're more of a band-aid than a cure?
Right, they're not getting to the root of the problem.
What about medications that do target that inflammation directly?
That's where topical glucocorticosteroids come in.
Right, right.
They're considered a mainstay of EOE treatment. Lots of evidence supporting their effectiveness.
And just to refresh our memory, topical means they're applied directly to the esophagus rather than taken orally, right?
You've got it.
Minimize the risk of side effects.
Exactly. Two common ones are bucinide and fluticasone.
Okay.
They're usually swallowed as a liquid or spray, allowing them to coat the lining of the esophagus and reduce inflammation.
Those names sound familiar. I feel like I've heard them in relation to other conditions.
You probably have. They're also used for things like asthma and allergies,
Oh, right, of course.
which just highlights the fact that inflammation plays a key role in a lot of different conditions, even if they seem unrelated.
So it's all about finding the right medication that targets those inflammatory pathways, no matter where they're happening in the body.
Precisely. Hitting those pathways where it matters.
And when it comes to EOE, those topical glucocorticosteroids have a pretty good track record.
They do. They've been very helpful for a lot of people.
But what about side effects? Are there any downsides to using these medications long term?
Well, the good news is topical glucocorticosteroids are generally well tolerated, especially compared to oral steroids.
Okay, that's good.
But there are some potential side effects to be aware of, things like oral thrush, which is a fungal infection in the mouth,
Right.
and there's a slight risk of adrenal suppression with prolonged use. So regular monitoring is important.
So it's all about weighing the benefits against the risks and working closely with your doctor to find the right balance.
Absolutely. It's a partnership, and it's important to remember that everyone responds to medications differently.
Right. What works for one person might not work for another.
Exactly. It's very individualized.
Speaking of individualized treatment, we briefly mentioned a newer medication called dupilumab.
Oh, yes, dupilumab.
Can you tell us a bit more about how it works and why it's generating so much excitement in the EOE community?
Sure, dupilumab is a monoclonal antibody that targets specific inflammatory pathways involved in EoE.
Okay.
It blocks the action of two key signaling molecules, IL-4 and IL-13.
IL-4 and IL-13, those are what, like messengers that tell the immune system to ramp up inflammation?
Exactly, they're the ones sending out the signals to attack.
And dupilumab blocks them.
It does. It basically cuts off communication between the generals and the troops, preventing them from waging war on your esophagus.
I love that analogy.
It's a good one, right?
It is. So is dupilumab a cure for EOE?
Not a cure, but it has shown some really promising results in clinical trials.
Okay.
It's already approved for treating certain allergic conditions like asthma and eczema, and it's currently being investigated for EoE.
So there's hope.
There is. The early data suggests it can significantly improve symptoms and even reduce eosinophil levels in the esophagus.
That's definitely encouraging.
It is. It's a potential game changer for people who haven't found relief with other treatments.
Okay, let's switch gears and talk about esophageal dilation, the procedure we mentioned earlier. Remind us again, when is this procedure typically considered?
Esophageal dilation is used when EoE has progressed to the point of causing a stricture or narrowing of the esophagus due to all that chronic inflammation and scarring.
Right, right.
And this narrowing, it makes it difficult for food to pass through comfortably.
It's got bottleneck.
Exactly. And that's when dilation comes into play.
Yeah.
It helps widen that narrowed area, making it easier to swallow.
But it's crucial to remember that dilation only addresses the symptom, the narrowing, not the underlying inflammation that caused it in the first place, right?
Absolutely. You've got to address the root cause as well.
So it's not a one-time fix. You'd still need to manage the EOE with medications or dietary changes to prevent the stricture from coming back.
That's right. It's part of a comprehensive management plan.
And as we mentioned earlier, there are risks associated with esophageal dilation, although they're rare.
Yeah, things like small tears in the lining of the esophagus, or even, in extremely rare cases, perforation, where a hole is created in the esophageal wall.
Oh, wow. That sounds scary, even if it's rare.
It is, which is why it's definitely a procedure that requires careful consideration and an experienced doctor.
Absolutely. Not a decision to be taken lightly.
No, but for some people with severe strictures, it can be life-changing, allowing them to eat more comfortably and improve their quality of life.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground on the treatment front. Now I want to shift gears and talk about something that's always on everyone's mind when they're diagnosed with a chronic condition.
Okay.
What's the long-term outlook for people with EOE?
That's a great question. And the good news is that while EoE is a chronic condition, meaning it can last for a long time or even a lifetime, it's manageable.
Okay, that's reassuring.
It is. It doesn't have to rule your life.
But are there any potential long-term complications of EOE that we should be aware of?
Well, one concern is the development of those esophageal strictures that we've been discussing.
Right, the narrowing.
Exactly. If the inflammation isn't controlled, it can lead to scarring and narrowing of the esophagus, causing persistent swallowing difficulties.
So early diagnosis and treatment are key to preventing this complication.
Absolutely. The sooner you address the inflammation, the better.
Okay, what else?
Another potential concern, although less common, is malnutrition.
Malnutrition. How does that relate to EOE?
Well, if the swallowing difficulties become severe and persistent, it can lead to reduced food intake.
Oh, right, because it's so hard to eat.
Exactly. And over time, that can lead to nutritional deficiencies.
Makes sense. So it's important to address any swallowing issues promptly and maybe work with a dietitian to make sure you're getting the nutrients you need.
Absolutely. A dietitian can be a great resource.
Okay, are there any other long-term concerns?
Well, remember that EoE is often associated with other allergic conditions like asthma, eczema, and food allergies.
Right, right. We talked about that connection earlier.
So managing those conditions is also crucial for overall health and well-being.
It's like a domino effect. Taking care of one aspect of your health can have a ripple effect on other areas.
Exactly. It's all interconnected. Addressing all aspects of your health, both physical and mental, can contribute to better EOE management and a better quality of life overall.
I like that. It's a holistic approach.
It is. It's about treating the whole person, not just the disease.
Well said. Now, before we move on to what's next on our deep dive adventure, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the emotional side of living with EOE.
Oh, absolutely.
It can't be easy dealing with a chronic condition that affects something as basic as eating.
You're right. The psychological impact of EOE is real and can be significant.
Yeah, imagine constantly worrying about what you can and can't eat, dealing with uncomfortable symptoms, and facing potential complications.
It can take a toll on your mental well-being. It's a lot to carry.
It's like having this invisible burden that you carry with you everywhere you go.
Exactly. The anxiety, the stress, even the social isolation that can accompany EOE, these are challenges that shouldn't be underestimated.
So, how can we support those living with EOE, not just physically, but also emotionally?
Awareness is a great first step. Recognizing and acknowledging the emotional burden of EOE is crucial.
Right, making it okay to talk about.
Exactly. And normalizing the conversation around these challenges. It's okay to not be okay sometimes, and seeking support is a sign of strength, not weakness.
Absolutely. Creating a safe space for people to share their experiences and connect with others who understand what they're going through can make a world of difference.
It really can. Connecting with others who get it, whether through support groups or online communities, can be incredibly validating and empowering.
And let's not forget the important role mental health professionals can play in providing support and coping strategies.
Right. Therapy can be incredibly helpful in developing healthy coping mechanisms, managing anxiety, and building resilience.
So it's all about taking a holistic approach to EOE management. Addressing the physical symptoms is essential, but neglecting the emotional aspect can hinder overall well-being.
Couldn't agree more. It's about treating the whole person, not just the disease.
Well said. Now I know we have a lot more to uncover about EOE, especially when it comes to the latest research and potential breakthroughs.
Oh, we've only just begun to explore the exciting possibilities on the horizon.
Can't wait.
Next, we'll dive into cutting-edge research, personalized medicine, and the potential of the gut microbiome to revolutionize EOE care.
Sounds fascinating. Stay tuned, everyone. We're about to venture into the frontiers of EOE research. And we're back for the final part of our deep dive into eosinophilic esophagitis.
The grand finale.
It is. And we've saved the best for last, all that cutting-edge research that's really shaping the future of EOE care.
It's a rapidly evolving field, lots of exciting developments happening.
So let's dive right in, shall we?
Let's do it.
All right, so first up, personalized medicine. I keep hearing that term everywhere, but what does it actually mean when we're talking about EOE?
Well, imagine a world where we can analyze your genes to predict which therapies will be most effective for you.
Whoa, so no more trial and error with treatments.
Exactly. We're moving away from that one-size-fits-all approach.
So it's like a tailor-made treatment plan based on your individual blueprint.
Precisely. We're starting to identify genes that predispose people to EOE or that influence how they respond to certain medications.
That's pretty amazing. Could this lead to preventative strategies? Like, if you know you're genetically at risk, could you make lifestyle changes to avoid EOE altogether?
That's the hope. Early intervention is key.
Right.
We could potentially screen individuals with a family history of EOE, identify those at higher risk, and guide them toward preventative measures.
Wow, that's like predicting the future of your health?
It does feel a bit futuristic, doesn't it?
It does, but the science is advancing so rapidly, it's incredible.
It really is. And on the treatment side, personalized medicine could help us choose the most effective medications from the get-go, minimizing side effects and healthcare costs.
So it's more targeted, more efficient.
Exactly. We're moving towards precision medicine.
I can't help but think about the ethical implications, though. Access to genetic testing, data privacy. Are those concerns being addressed?
Absolutely. As this technology evolves, it's crucial to have those open and honest conversations about responsible and ethical implementation.
Right, making sure it's accessible to everyone and that people's privacy is protected.
Exactly. It's a powerful tool, but like any tool, it needs to be used wisely and ethically.
Okay, let's move on to another area that's been generating a lot of buzz, the gut microbiome.
The gut microbiome, always a fascinating topic.
It is. We talked about it briefly before, but can you delve a little deeper into how our gut bacteria might be influencing EOE?
Sure. Think of your gut as an ecosystem, teeming with trillions of bacteria.
Right, a whole world living inside us.
Exactly, and we now know these bacteria play a crucial role in immune system development and regulation.
So our immune system is constantly interacting with our gut bacteria, almost like a training ground.
That's a great way to put it. They're constantly communicating and influencing each other.
But what happens when this ecosystem gets out of balance?
That's when things can go awry.
What if the bad bacteria start to outnumber the good guys?
Well, these imbalances, called dysbiosis, can trigger a cascade of inflammation throughout the body.
And that includes the esophagus.
Unfortunately, yes, the esophagus is not immune to these inflammatory effects.
So could these gut microbiome imbalances actually be contributing to EOE?
That's a question researchers are actively investigating.
Okay.
And some studies have shown distinct differences in the gut bacteria of people with EOE compared to healthy individuals.
Oh, interesting. So if we can restore a healthy balance of bacteria, could that potentially improve EOE symptoms?
That's the exciting part. There are a few promising approaches being explored.
All right, tell me more.
One is the use of probiotics, those friendly bacteria you can find in supplements or fermented foods.
Right, right. So eating yogurt or taking a probiotic could actually make a difference for someone with EOE.
It's definitely an area of active research. The early results are promising.
What else?
And then there's the more dramatic approach,
Hmm.
fecal microbiota transplantation, or FMT for short.
FMT, that sounds intense.
It is. Essentially, you're transferring fecal matter from a healthy donor to a recipient.
Oh, wow.
I know it sounds strange,
It does, it does.
but it's been remarkably effective for certain gut infections.
So you're essentially giving the recipient a whole new gut microbiome.
Exactly. It's a pretty radical approach, but it holds promise for conditions like EOE that are thought to be linked to gut dysbiosis.
It's amazing how much we're learning about the gut microbiome and its impact on our health.
It really is. It highlights the interconnectedness of our bodies in a way we never fully appreciated before.
Okay, let's talk about new medications being developed for EOE. We discussed dupilumab earlier, which targets IL-4 and IL-13. Are there other promising drugs in the pipeline that work differently?
Oh, there's several. One class being investigated is JK inhibitors.
JK inhibitors, those are.
They block certain enzymes involved in inflammation,
Okay.
and they've been effective in treating conditions like rheumatoid arthritis.
So they're basically shutting down those inflammatory pathways.
Exactly. They're like the bouncers at the inflammation party, keeping things under control.
I like that analogy.
And the good news is they're showing early promise in EOE as well, potentially reducing eosinophils and easing symptoms.
Okay, what else is in the pipeline?
Another interesting class is S1P receptor modulators.
S1P receptor modulators, and those work by.
They regulate the movement of immune cells, like those eosinophils we've been talking about,
Okay.
potentially preventing them from reaching the esophagus in the first place.
So they're like traffic cops, redirecting those inflammatory cells away from the esophagus.
Exactly, keeping them from causing trouble.
And they've already been approved for multiple sclerosis, so their safety profile is well established.
That's right, which is always a good thing when we're talking about new medications.
It is. It's amazing how research in one area can lead to breakthroughs in seemingly unrelated fields.
It's all connected, it really is.
Okay, before we wrap up, I want to touch on a newer, less invasive way to diagnose EOE, the esophageal string test.
Ah, the Citus sponge. It's really changing the game, especially for kids.
Tell me more. How does it work?
You swallow a capsule attached to a string. The capsule dissolves, releasing a sponge that collects cells as it's pulled back up through the esophagus.
So no more endoscopy for everyone.
Well, endoscopy is still the gold standard, but the string test is a great option for those who can't or don't want to undergo a more invasive procedure.
That's fantastic. More options, more choices for patients. It's all about empowering people to take control of their health.
I couldn't agree more.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into eosinophilic esophagitis. It's been quite a journey.
It has. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, from the basics to the cutting-edge research that's really pushing the boundaries of EOE care.
And it's only going to get more exciting from here.
I believe it. For anyone listening who's been diagnosed with EOE, remember that you're not alone. There are resources available, support networks, and most importantly, hope for the future.
Absolutely. Research is advancing rapidly, and with it, the promise of better treatments and a brighter outlook for people with EOE.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.
Always exploring.